A woman cannot hold this house. The Duke of Thornfield said it the way other men remarked upon the weather, without heat, without cruelty even, which somehow made it colder than any shout, and the great hall of Ravenscourt seemed to lean in around his words. 40 candles burned in the iron chandelier above him. The long table gleamed with silver and frost-white linen. And at its far end a young woman in plain gray wool stood very still and did not lift her eyes. Cordelia did not weep, she did not protest. She folded her hands once before her, the way a woman folds away a letter she has already read to its end, and she let the silence settle over the room like dust. You will sign the household over to my cousin's stewardship by the season's close. Alaric Thornfield continued, turning a glass of dark wine in his long fingers, and you will be spared the indignity of pretending to manage what was never yours to manage. The guests at his table smiled into their plates. The cousin, Marcus, smiled widest of all. And no one in that gilded hall, not the Duke, not the cousin, not the steward standing oily and watchful at the door, noticed the thing that should have warned them all, that the woman they had just dismissed wore no fear in her face at all, only a cool and patient certainty. The certainty of someone who already holds the only card that matters and is simply waiting for the table to be set. For the deed to Ravenscourt, sealed in a banker's vault in London, already bore her name. And a letter from her father's bank was even then turning up the frozen drive in a black carriage. A letter that would, before the candles guttered low, unmake every proud assumption in that house. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Before we go on, if stories of cold dukes and the women who undo them are why you are here tonight, take one moment to subscribe and tell me in the comments where in the world you are watching from, because tonight's story is one I think you will not soon forget. Now, let us return to how a woman came to hold a house that a duke believed was his. Cordelia Wren had not come to Ravenscourt as a bride in the way the songs describe. She had come as the answer to a debt. The old Duke, Alaric's late father, had spent the last decade of his life gambling against his own fortune and losing with magnificent consistency, mortgaging the timber, then the farms, then the river rights, then at last the very stones of the estate, until the grand and famous house stood like a beautiful woman and a gown gone threadbare at the hems, still proud, still upright. But only a hard winter away from ruin. When the old Duke died, he left his son a title that opened every door in England and an estate that could not pay its own coal bill. The creditors came softly at first, then less softly, and the largest of them all was the banking house of Wren, a quiet, immensely powerful private bank that had purchased one by one every note the old Duke had ever signed. The head of that house, Cordelia's father, was a man of merchant blood and no title, and he made the new Duke an offer that was, beneath its courtesy, a closing trap. The debt would be forgiven, the bank's hand stayed, the estate saved from the auctioneer's hammer if the Duke would marry his daughter. Alaric Thornfield agreed because he had no other path. And he agreed with the same chill contempt he might have shown a tradesman come to mend a gate. He did not love her. He did not intend to. He told himself the marriage was a transaction, and that he would conduct it as one, and on the morning Cordelia arrived at Ravenscourt with 2 plain trunks and a maid she had not been given. He received her in the long gallery beneath the portraits of his ancestors and looked at her gray wool dress and her unfashionable stillness and decided, in the space of a breath, that she was beneath the house she had purchased him out of ruin. What he did not understand what no man in that house could have understood, because they had never once thought to ask, was that Cordelia Wren had been raised at her father's elbow inside the marble halls of the bank. She had read ledgers before she read poetry. She knew to the shilling what Ravenscourt owed and what it could earn, knew which of its farms were sound and which were rotted, knew the exact weight of every chain that bound the Duke to her family's name. And she knew, because her father had told her plainly on the day she left, that the deed itself, the great parchment deed to the whole estate, did not belong to the Duke at all. It had been signed over to the bank against the final and largest debt, and her father, dying himself by then, though he hid it well, had quietly placed that deed in Cordelia's own name as her dowry and her shield. She owned the floor the Duke walked upon. She owned the chair he sat in to insult her, and she had chosen, for reasons of her own, to say nothing of it at all, to come into that cold house in plain wool and watch, the way her father had taught her to watch, until she understood exactly what manner of people she had married into. Her father had been a hard man, but not a cold one, and the lesson he had pressed upon her most often, in the long evenings when other girls were being taught the harp and the language of fans, was this, that the world will always tell you who it believes you to be before it shows you who it truly is, and that the wise woman holds her tongue through the first telling and saves her strength for the second. He had built his bank from a single counting house in Cheapside into a power that lent to dukes and was owed by kings, and he had done it not with charm, of which he had little, but with patience, of which he had an ocean, and with the unfashionable habit of being right when louder men were wrong. When the physicians told him, the winter before Cordelia's wedding, that his heart would not see another spring, he did not weep and he did not rage. He sent for his daughter, and he laid before her the whole architecture of the trap he had built around the house of Thornfield. And he said to her, I cannot leave you a title, child, for titles are not mine to give. But I can leave you something a title can never be, the ground a title stands upon. Marry the Duke. Let him think he is doing you a kindness. And never, until the hour is exactly ripe, let any soul in that house guess that the kindness runs the other way. She had buried him quietly 2 months before she crossed the threshold of Ravenscourt, and she had carried his lesson into that house the way a soldier carries powder, dry and hidden and ready, and she had waited. Ravenscourt in those first weeks was a study in beautiful decay. The dinners were still magnificent in the way of a house spending its last reserves on appearances, roast pheasant under glistening skins, glazed pears and buttered parsnips, clear amber consomme and porcelain that had been in the family 300 years. Chilled creams and a tower of hothouse grapes grown in glass houses the estate could no longer afford to heat. The chandeliers blazed. The marble floors shone under the labor of servants who had not been paid their full wages in 2 seasons and dared not say so. The long gallery held 200 years of Thornfield faces in gilt frames, dukes and duchesses in ermine and pearls. And beneath them ran sideboards crowded with the family plate, chased silver tureens, candelabra heavy as anchors, salvers engraved with the Thornfield crest of a raven on a barred field. The library held 5,000 books no one in the house had opened in a generation, their gold-tooled spines dimming gently in the damp because the fires were not lit often enough to keep the rot away. There were Turkey carpets worn pale along the paths the family walked, and still rich as wine where no foot fell. There were tall windows of old wavering glass that turned the winter gardens into something underwater and strange, there was, everywhere, the particular splendor of a house that is not yet admitted it can no longer afford itself. And through it all moved the Duke, magnificent and remote, and beside him his cousin Marcus, a softer and greedier shadow of the Thornfield blood, a man who had spent his life one inheritance removed from everything he wanted and had decided, in the careful way of patient men, to take it. Marcus had grown up in this house as the poor cousin, the spare boy housed in the spare room, dressed in the heir's outgrown coats, taught at every turn that the world had a place for him, and that it was always just to the left of the place he wanted. Some men, ground that way, grow humble. Marcus had grown hungry. He had learned to smile while he counted, to flatter while he measured, and somewhere in the long years of being almost a Thornfield, he had decided that what the blood would not give him freely, he would simply take by patience and by craft. And he had found in the steward Pell a man whose appetites matched his own, and whose access to the estate's papers made him the perfect instrument. Cordelia watched the cousin most of all. She watched the way Marcus complimented the Duke, and then, when the Duke had turned away, let his eyes travel over the silver and the portraits and the long windows with the slow appetite of a man pricing a house he means to own. She watched the steward, a thin, grasping creature named Pell, lean close to the cousin in doorways and fall silent whenever she passed. And she watched her husband, the cold Duke, sit at the head of his dining table and believe, with the perfect confidence of a man who has never once been wrong about his own importance, that he was the master of all of it. He was not. He was simply the last to know. The house was vast, and a woman in gray wool whom no one troubled to notice could move through it like weather, and so Cordelia learned its secrets the way water learns a wall, patiently, finding every crack. She learned that the west wing was shut up to save on fuel. She learned that the gamekeeper had not been replaced and the deer were being poached. And on a gray afternoon, 3 weeks into her marriage, walking a corridor she was not expected to walk, she learned the worst of it. The library door stood ajar, and within it the cousin Marcus and the steward Pell stood over a spread of papers, speaking low, and Cordelia stopped just beyond the light and made herself into stillness and listened. "The marriage can be set aside," Pell was saying, his voice the careful voice of a man who has thought a thing through. "She came with no fortune of her own that the Duke can touch, only her father's forgiveness of the debt, and her father is dead now these 2 months. A wife with no fortune is easily set aside. A quiet annulment, grounds of fraud in the contract, and she goes back to London with her trunks and her plain dresses, and the Duke is free." Marcus laughed softly, a sound with no warmth in it at all. "And the estate?" "The estate is the difficulty," Pell admitted. "The deed went to the bank. But the bank is leaderless now, old wren in the ground, and a leaderless bank can be negotiated with. We buy the deed back at a fraction. In your name, cousin, not the Duke's. Let the Duke keep his title and his pride. You will keep Ravenscourt. He need never know the ground was sold beneath him until the day you choose to tell him. And the Duke," Marcus pressed, "will simply let the ground be sold from beneath him?" "The Duke," said Pell, and here his voice took on the smooth contempt of a servant who has long despised the master he bows to, "is a proud man. And a proud man is the easiest of all men to manage, because he cannot bear to be told he has been a fool. We need only never tell him. He keeps his title, his portraits, his name in the society pages. He rides to London and is bowed to. And he never thinks to ask who holds the parchment, because to ask would be to admit he does not already know. Pride is a wall a clever man can hide a whole estate behind. Marcus laughed again, delighted. And the girl? He said. The girl, said Pell, with a small dismissive breath that Cordelia would remember a long time, is no one. A merchant's daughter in borrowed grandeur. Bankers breed daughters the way they breed clerks, to be useful and then to be dismissed. When the annulment is done, she will be glad enough to vanish back to her ledgers and her gray dresses. Women like her are made to be set aside. They expect it. They are raised to it. You will see, she will not even raise her voice. It was that last cruelty, more than all the rest, that Cordelia carried out of the corridor with her, because it was so nearly true and so entirely wrong. They had read her stillness correctly, and her meaning not at all. She had indeed been raised to be useful. She had not been raised to be dismissed. Cordelia stood in the cold corridor and did not move. And the rage that rose in her was not the hot kind that spends itself in a moment. It was the other kind, the patient kind, the kind that banks itself like a coal under ash and keeps its heat. She did not burst into the room. She did not weep. She turned very quietly and walked on, and the only sign of what she had heard was the way her folded hands tightened just once before they loosened again. They thought the deed was the bank's to sell. They did not know the bank had already sold it to her. They were plotting to buy back a house that was already hers. And the only thing they had correctly judged was the one thing they were most wrong about, that she was no one. It was on her way back from that corridor that Cordelia first truly noticed the maid. The girl could not have been more than 16, thin as a winter bird, with chapped red hands and eyes that flinched at every raised voice in that house. Her name was Tess, and she was on her knees in the cold scullery passage, scrubbing a flagstone that had already been scrubbed clean, weeping silently because the cousin Marcus had cuffed her for spilling wine at dinner, and the steward had docked a week's wages she had never been fully paid in the first place. Cordelia stopped. In a house where the great ones stepped over the small ones as if they were furniture, she crouched down in her plain gray wool beside a weeping kitchen girl, and she took the cold, chapped hands in her own, and she said, quietly, "Stop scrubbing what is already clean. No one here has the right to make you smaller than you are. Go and warm yourself, and tell the cook I sent you." The girl stared at her as though she had grown wings. It was the first kindness anyone of rank had shown her in that house in living memory, and she would not forget it, and as it happened, neither would the world. For kindness, Cordelia's father had once told her, is the only investment that pays in seasons you cannot predict. The cruelty, when it came sharpened. The Duke held a dinner near the close of that month, a glittering thing to which he invited the county's finest, in part Cordelia understood at once, to begin the public work of unmarrying her. It was a magnificent table, the last great splendor the estate could ill afford and would not be able to afford much longer, a soup of clear golden consomme, a turbot in cream. Roast pheasant and partridge dressed in their own bright feathers, a saddle of venison, glazed carrots and buttered asparagus and warm white rolls. A trembling tower of chilled custards and a centerpiece of hothouse roses forced into bloom in the dead of winter at a cost that would have paid the under-gardeners for a year. Crystal caught the candlelight and threw it back in 1,000 points of fire. The guests wore their finest and their hardest faces, the county's marquises and their painted wives, the sort of people who measure a newcomer's worth before the soup is cold and are rarely generous in the reckoning. And into that glittering, pitiless room the Duke sent his merchant wife to be quietly destroyed. She was placed not at her husband's side where a duchess belonged, but far down the table among the lesser cousins and the poor relations, below the great silver salt cellar that in the old fashion divided the worthy guests from the unworthy, and she felt the eyes of the room note it and understand it. The cousin Marcus, flushed with wine and ambition, made a show of it. He lifted his glass toward her down the long table and said, loud enough for the laughter to carry, to the Duke's little merchant bride, may she always remember that a house like this was built for blood, not banking, and that some of us were born to hold it while others were only ever passing through. The table laughed. The Duke did not laugh, but neither did he stop it. He watched his wife from the head of the table with cold curiosity, the way a man watches a creature to see whether it will break. Cordelia did not break. She lifted her own glass, plain water in it, and she met the cousin's eyes down the length of that gleaming table, and she said, in a voice that was quiet and yet reached every ear in that suddenly attentive room, some houses outlast the men who think they own them. I would not be too certain, cousin. Which of us is passing through? For a moment, no one laughed at all. The Duke's gaze sharpened on her, the first true attention he had ever paid her. A flicker of something that was not quite alarm and not quite respect, but was, for the first time, the recognition that the woman he had dismissed had a blade beneath the gray wool. Then the cousin recovered and called for more wine, and the moment closed over like water, and the dinner ground on toward its glittering, doomed conclusion. But the Duke did not stop watching her after that. And later, when the guests had gone, he found her alone in the long gallery beneath his ancestors' portraits, and for the first time he spoke to her not as a creditor's daughter, but as a man genuinely uncertain of the ground beneath his feet. "What did you mean by it?" he asked. "Your toast." Cordelia looked up at the portrait of his grandfather, the second Duke, who had built the East Wing and lost the family's first fortune doing it. "I meant," she said, "that you have spent a month believing you understand everything that is happening in your own house, and you understand almost none of it. I meant that the men who flatter you in daylight are counting your silver in the dark. I meant, Your Grace, that you are about to lose Ravenscourt, and you do not even know it is being taken." His jaw tightened. "Ravenscourt cannot be taken. It is mine. It was your father's," she said gently, "and your father, God rest him, spent it down to the deed itself. Do you know who holds that deed tonight, Alaric Thornfield? Do you know whose name is written upon the parchment that says who owns the stones of this hall?" He did not answer, because he did not know, and she saw in his face the moment he realized he did not know, and saw too the pride that would not let him ask a merchant's daughter to explain his own ruin to him. "Think on it," she said. And she left him there beneath his ancestors, a cold, proud man alone in a house he had just been told was no longer his. And she let the long night do its work upon him. She did not tell him the answer. She had learned in the marble halls of her father's bank that you never give a desperate man the whole truth at once. You give him the size of the hole, and you let him climb down into it, and you wait at the top with the rope. The reckoning came on a clear, bitter afternoon a week later, and it came up the frozen drive in a black carriage drawn by 4 matched grays, the carriage of the banking house of Wren. Cordelia had sent for it. She had written in her own hand to the trustees her father had left to administer the bank in her name until her marriage was settled, and she had told them precisely what she had overheard in the library and precisely what she wished done. And they had come. The great doors of Ravenscourt opened upon the cold, and a tall, composed man in a black coat, the bank's senior secretary, a Mr. Halloran, crossed the frozen marble of the great hall, while the household stood frozen in another sense entirely. The Duke was there, and a cousin Marcus, who had gone the color of old wax, and a steward Pell, whose careful hands had begun, very slightly, to shake. Mr. Halloran did not bow to the Duke. He did not glance at the cousin. He walked the length of that great hall, past the Duke at its head, past the cousin half risen from his chair, and he stopped before the woman in gray wool standing quietly by the window, and he bowed to her, deep and formal, the bow owed to the principal of the greatest private bank in England. "Madam," he said, "the matter is settled as you instructed. Every note your late father held against this estate has been called in and consolidated into the deed, and the deed stands, as it has stood since your wedding day, in your sole name. Ravenscourt is yours. It has been yours from the hour you crossed its threshold." The silence that followed had a shape to it, a vast, unmaking shape, as a month of cold assumptions came apart at once in the minds of every soul in that hall. It was the particular silence that falls when a great many people realize, all in the same instant, that the ground they have been standing on is not the ground they fought, that the woman they stepped over was the floor itself. A footman dropped a salver, and the clang of it rang against the marble and died, and no one so much as turned. The Duke stared at his wife as though she had transformed before his eyes from gray wool into something he had no name for, and perhaps she had, for the stillness that had read as meekness now read, in the bright light of what he understood, as exactly what it had always been. The perfect composure of a person who has been holding the winning hand the whole long while and has simply been waiting for the others to finish their bidding. The cousin Marcus surged to his feet. "That is a lie," he said too loud. "The deed is to be bought back. I have an arrangement with the bank. Pell, tell him we have an arrangement. You have an arrangement," said Mr. Halloran, without raising his voice at all, with a steward who promised you a thing that was never his to sell. In the name of a bank he never spoke to buy a deed that was never for sale. There is no arrangement, sir. There is only a record of every letter you sent, every sum you offered, every word of the annulment you schemed with this man to force upon the Duchess. We have it all. The lady saw to that. And now the steward Pell broke, as the weak link always breaks first, babbling that it had been the cousin's design, all of it the cousin's, that he had only done as he was bid, and the cousin turned on the steward with a snarl, and the two of them stood in the center of that great hall, tearing at each other with words, while the truth they had both built came down around them. And through all of it the Duke said nothing. He sat at the head of his table, her table, and he looked at his wife, and Cordelia walked the length of the hall to stand before him, and she spoke the one quiet line she had been keeping for a month. "You told me a woman could not hold this house," she said. I did not argue. I never argue with a man about a thing I have already done. Then the world delivered its justice, as the world will, without Cordelia lifting her hand to it. The bank, now openly hers, called in the small private debts the cousin Marcus had run up across the county on the strength of his expectations of Ravenscourt, debts he had taken cheerfully, certain the estate would soon be his to pay them with. And within a fortnight Marcus Thornfield was exposed across 3 counties as a man who had borrowed grandly against a house that had never been his, and the doors that had opened to him closed, one after another, with the soft finality of a season's end. The society pages, which adore nothing so much as a fallen schemer, printed the whole affair, how the Duke's own cousin had plotted with a venal steward to annul a marriage and seize an estate, and how the merchant's daughter they had all sneered at had owned the ground beneath their feet the entire time. The steward Pell was dismissed without character, which in those days was a kind of slow ruin all its own. And Marcus, stripped of his expectations and his credit and his welcome, left the county a poorer and smaller man than he had entered it, punished not by Cordelia's hand, but by the simple consequence of his own greed catching up the bill. There was a particular justice in the manner of his fall, for Marcus Thornfield had spent his whole life borrowing against a future he had not yet stolen. Dining on credit, dressing on credit, charming on the strength of an inheritance that existed nowhere but in his own scheming, and when the truth came out that the inheritance had never been his and never would be, every merchant and moneylender and hopeful creditor in 3 counties came calling at once, and there was nothing behind the smile to pay them with. He had built a life on the appearance of a thing he did not possess, and when the appearance cracked, the whole edifice came down in a single season. The clubs that had welcomed him found their memberships suddenly full. The hostesses who had seated him beside their daughters discovered prior engagements. The tailors and the wine merchants and the keepers of the gaming tables, who forgive a great deal in a man they believe will one day be rich, forgive nothing at all in a man they have learned never will be. He did not go to prison, for he had broken no law that a clever lawyer could not muddy. He had only schemed, and schemed badly, against a woman who schemed better. But he went out of the county a ruined name, which in that world was a death of its own kind, and the last anyone heard of him he was living modestly abroad on the charity of a distant relation, dining at last on exactly the portion he had always been given and had never once been grateful for. She did not strike him. She did not need to. The world, it turned out, kept very careful accounts. But the cousin's ruin was the backdrop, not the story, for the true unfinished business of Ravenscourt stood at the head of its own table, undone in a different way entirely. In the weeks that followed, the Duke of Thornfield was a man remade by humiliation into something better than he had been. He came to her, not as a master, for he had no mastery left to wield, and not as a debtor. For the debt was forgiven, but as a man, which he had never quite managed to be in her presence before. He found her one evening in the library, where she had once stood listening to her own betrayal, going over the estate's accounts by candlelight, restoring order to a house that had been bled for a generation. He stood in the doorway a long while before he spoke. "I owe you an apology that I do not know how to make large enough," he said at last. "I looked at you, and I saw a transaction. I told you a woman could not hold this house, and you have held it better in a month than my family held it in 100 years." Cordelia set down her pen. "You saw what you were taught to see," she said, "and there was no cruelty in it, only the truth. Your father raised you to believe a house was held by blood and pride. He left you proof, in the ruin he handed you, of exactly how far blood and pride go when the coal bill comes due. I was not your enemy, Alaric. I was the only thing standing between your name and the auctioneer's hammer. You simply could not see it because you had never once looked at me. I am looking now. he said, and he was. The cold had gone out of him, melted not by a grand gesture, but by the slow daily evidence of a woman who had saved everything he had and asked for nothing but the chance to be seen. It is a strange thing how a proud man falls. It is never all at once. It is the morning he watches her settle a dispute between two tenants with a fairness his own father never showed, and finds he is proud of her and ashamed of himself in the same breath. It is the evening he comes upon her asleep over the account books with the candle guttering, a smudge of ink upon her cheek, and feels something turn over in his chest that has no use and no profit in it, and that he cannot, for all his cleverness, talk himself out of. It is the day he hears, quite by accident, a kitchen maid speak the Duchess's name with a warmth no one in that house had ever spoken his, and understands that this woman he had seated below the salt was building, quietly and without his help, the only kind of loyalty that cannot be bought or inherited, but only earned. He had married her believing he was selling his pride for her father's gold. He discovered, by degrees that humbled him to the root, that he had been given something he had never thought to want, and could not now imagine living without. He learned the accounts at her side. He learned the names of the tenants his family had let go hungry. He learned, most strangely of all, to be in a room with his wife and want nothing from her but her company. And Cordelia, who had armored herself in gray wool and stillness against a world that had only ever wanted to set her aside, found the armor growing heavy, and by degrees she did not announce even to herself, set it down. She had not married for love, neither had he. But love, it seems, is not always a thing brought into a house at the start. Sometimes it is built there, stone by patient stone, by two people who finally learned to look at one another. By spring, Ravenscourt was not the same house. The glass houses were lit again, paid for now out of honest banking instead of borrowed grandeur, and early peaches ripened against the warm brick, where for years there had been only frost and neglect. The west wing was opened, its dust sheets pulled back from furniture that had not seen daylight in a decade, and the long-shut rooms filled again with light and air and the sound of work being done. The library fires were lit every evening now, drying out the slow damp that had been eating the gold-tooled spines, and on quiet nights the Duke and Duchess of Thornfield could be found there together, he reading aloud while she went over the season's accounts, the two of them folded into the same circle of candlelight that had once divided a great hall into the worthy and the worthless. The home farm was sound again, the poached deer park was restocked, and a new gamekeeper installed. The county, which had laughed at the merchant's bride below the salt, began to find reasons to call at Ravenscourt, and discovered there a house warmer and better run than it had been within living memory, and a duke who, against every expectation, seemed at last to be content. The tenants who had been turned out were called back, and the wages that had gone unpaid for 2 seasons were paid in full with interest, on Cordelia's own instruction, for she had not forgotten what it was to be told she was no one, and neither had she forgotten the girl in the scullery passage. She raised Tess up out of the kitchens and made her in time the keeper of the household stores, a position of trust and a fair wage, and the thin, frightened bird of a girl grew into a steady, capable young woman who would run that household small economy with a sharp, honest eye for 40 years, and tell her grandchildren some day about the Duchess in gray wool who had crouched on a cold flagstone to take her chapped hands and tell her she had the right to be no smaller than she was. For Cordelia had learned, in the marble halls of her father's bank, and in the cold hall of her husband's house, the single truth that governed both, that a person is not the same as their station, that worth wears no livery, and that the surest way to know the size of a soul is to watch how it treats the souls it believes it never needs to fear. Pride, she would say in her later years, may hold a house for a generation, but it is character that holds it for 100, and only love that makes it worth holding at all. And so I will leave you tonight with the question that Ravenscourt itself seemed to ask, standing lit and warm and whole again upon its hill, for the cousin Marcus, who schemed and lied and tried to set aside a woman he never bothered to understand, was ruined utterly by the world, and left the county with nothing. Some would say he was paid exactly what he was owed, and not a penny more than justice. But others might wonder whether a man so small was ever truly worth the ruin, or whether Grace would have cost the Duchess less than it cost her to watch the world break him. So tell me, before you go, if you had been Cordelia, standing in that hall, holding the deed and the proof and the whole of his fate in your folded hands, would you have let the world ruin Marcus Thornfield as it did? Or would you have shown him a mercy he had never once shown you? Tell me in the comments, and tell me where in the world you are watching from, and if a cold heart melted, and a quiet woman who held more than anyone knew is the kind of story you came here for, then subscribe and stay close. For there is always another house with another secret and another Lord who learns, too late and just in time, exactly who he married. Until next time, remember that the proudest house in England is still only stone, and that the worth of any soul beneath its roof was never in the title it carried, but in the heart it kept when it believed no one of consequence was watching.